The headlines could not be any clearer. Leftists with plans to upend the economy wins the Colombian presidency. Former guerrilla Gustavo Petro pledges to expand the state control of the economy. That in itself is a headline, but the real headline reads how Gustavo Petro has overcome decades of establishment rule in U.S.'s top Latin American ally. How has he done that? And does he plan to ally the country with the U.S. like in the past? Just a couple questions we'll be asking in this edition of The Spotlight, including why Latin American countries are going left overall and perhaps away from U.S. and Western influence. First, these are the guests for this edition of The Spotlight. Co-chair of the Green Party of the United States, Ahmed Eltouny, who joins us from Union, New Jersey. Also joining us is an author and journalist, Arnold August, who joins us from Montreal. Welcome to you both. Arnold August, I'm going to first start with you. We're looking at this win, Gustavo Petro winning the Colombian presidential election. And in general, the description has been given that this will make him the first left-wing leader in the South American nation's history and the first former insurgent. Tell us, first of all, the significance of why this is so important, in your opinion.
Well, it's extremely important. As you said, it's the first time in over 200 years that a left-wing person has become a president, along with his vice president elect. Now, we have to take into account that many years of Uribe dictatorship in Colombia, the very close ties between Colombia on the one hand and the United States on the other hand, to the extent that Colombia has been honored to have a special relationship with NATO. It goes to show you how close they were. Of course, last time I looked at a map, Colombia is not even close to being anywhere in the North Atlantic, but it gives you a very good idea of how close the ties have been. So it's really earth-shaking that you have a presidential ticket who is on the left and has a tendency towards taking a relatively independent stance with regards to the United States. And I think that, of course, all of the Latin American leaders were very happy. Of course, they congratulated the Petro Marquez ticket, indicating that this is a new move for Latin America towards the left. This is true, right. But the fact that it's so important and earth-shaking is sort of a double-edged sword. There's also a negative thing that one has to take into account, which I guess I could deal with later.
Okay. Well, I was going to get into this a little bit later, but let's get right into it, Ahmed Eltouny, in terms of how we're looking at this move to the left being defined as a move away from Western influence, in particular the U.S. Tell us why that is important. I mean, Latin American countries or other countries around the world, they want to have a close relationship with the U.S. But what has led the countries, in this particular case in Latin America, and of course Colombia, to have distanced themselves from that?
It's years of oppression, years of U.S. imperialism. I mean, when you think back to the days of Efrain Montt in Guatemala, and where we are today, it's kind of self-explanatory why we're headed in this direction. And the U.S. has been pushing back. I mean, I like to say that what we're seeing here is the second wave of the pink tide. In the early 2000s, we saw this starting, and with the Bush administration, I don't want to say turned a blind eye, but they were a bit incompetent in terms of Latin American politics. What they focused primarily in the Middle East with the Iraq War and all that, and that kind of allowed movements in Venezuela to come up with Chavez and Rafael Correa and Mojica in Uruguay, and then with the Obama administration afterwards, we kind of saw a reverse of that, and almost to an extreme, as we saw with Bolsonaro come in Brazil, kind of completely in the opposite direction. So what we're seeing now is a second wave of that pink tide, where right now we're seeing leftist governments pop up in Peru with Pedro Castillo, in Chile, in Argentina, Nicaragua with Ortega, obviously, and AMLO in Mexico, and even in Brazil itself, there are predictions that Lula is going to beat Bolsonaro this year. So we're going to see kind of a clean sweep in in Latin America. And what makes this election in Colombia so historic is that Colombia was Old Faithful for the United States. I mean, like my colleague over here said, it's been over 200 years, and we've never seen a leftist government in Colombia. They joined NATO as a global partner in 2017, which just shows you that extreme relationship between the U.S. and Colombia, how they could always depend on them for their imperialistic endeavors and ambitions. And so seeing this happen in Colombia right now, this is a special day. And I think all of Latin America is rejoicing. And it's a big deal for the world, too, because,
Sure.
Once you do that clean sweep in Latin America, you've got other parts in the world who are also suffering from imperialism from the West and Europe. So hopefully this is going to be a starting point for more of a global trend heading into the left.
Well, if somebody from the outside is listening to this Arnold August, they're going to say, maybe, what are we talking about here? Maybe it's good to review what has happened economically speaking from countries that were aligned with the West, that were aligned with the U.S., because looking at just some of the stats, annual economic growth from 2013 through 2019 was just 1.2%. Poverty dropped from 45.6% in 2003 to 27.8% in 2014, but since then it has gone up and hit 32.1% in 2021. Extreme poverty, corruption, and just an economic system that should have benefited from it being somewhat mixed with the Western opportunities, but it didn't pan out. So this is where we are. Is that the main reason why we're seeing the move to the left and away from the Western systems?
For sure. I mean, these statistics that you mentioned and many others indicate why people are revolting, for example, in Colombia with regard to this historic elections. And just by coincidence, I guess, while the elections were going on in Colombia, you have in Ecuador an important mass movement against the pro-U.S. right-wing government in Ecuador. So this is an ongoing thing. But I think that the danger is, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. We're all happy. It's a great victory. And believe it or not, the United States issued a statement yesterday, only several hours after the results of the elections. I'll just read one point. I think it's important. Blinken said the U.S. and Colombia enjoy. First, he congratulates the winning ticket. Then he said the U.S. and Colombia enjoy deep bonds between our peoples, shared values, and shared interests in democracy, security, inclusive economic prosperity, and human rights. He goes on to say cooperation between the U.S. and Colombia has improved public health, livelihoods, rule of law, and environmental protections of both our countries and throughout the region. I mean, the United States should wake up, because this has not been the case of Colombia. It is this very reason why the majority of Colombians dare to courageously stand up, go against the tide, and vote for this left-wing ticket to oppose these problems that are caused by the U.S. in the first place. But one has to be careful. We cannot, for example, what happened in Chile. I mean, of course, we cannot compare Chile to Colombia, and the Petro Marquez ticket, of course, can be compared to Allende. But what happened there? They actually overthrew that elected government. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but given the importance of Colombia, as all three of us have mentioned right from the beginning, one could also expect some action by the United States to try to undo this historic victory.
Okay, let's talk about the challenges in terms of Colombia, in this case in point. Ahmed Eltouny, one of the promises that Petro has said is that he wants to ensure that peasants are going to have their rights guaranteed. This is just one example that I picked against multinational corporations, including Colombian oligarchs. Now, when you talk about multinational corporations, isn't that going to be tough to try to take any stake that they may have in the economy? Because many of them have strong ties to the West, especially the U.S.
Yeah, well, in every case around the world, anytime there's a revolution, step one is to prepare for the counter-revolution. I mean, it really is as simple as that. I mean, we're seeing this right now in Venezuela. What's happening, what the Maduro government has been going through for the past 10 years or so has been immense U.S. pressure and sanctions against that country, trying to get the Bolivarian revolution to fail. So what we're going to see in Colombia, when you have what I called Old Faithful earlier, have this historic election, yes, the U.S. is probably going to try to interfere, and these multinational companies are going to try to put an immense amount of pressure on our Department of State to do something about this. And given the violent history in Colombia, I am worried for the life of Petro, but hopefully Petro is going to be safe, and Marquez as well. But at the end of the day, accomplishing these things is going to be difficult given the struggles that we've seen in the past. But because right now we're seeing these widespread revolutions happen throughout Latin America, you can depend on other allied countries in the region to fulfill these goals that you have. Venezuela is a great example how one of the major struggles that they had was because Colombia was such a great ally of the U.S. that they applied that same amount of pressure on Venezuela and cut off complete diplomatic ties. And so this made things really difficult on Venezuela because they share a border with Colombia. And now that we have Colombia joining the pink tide, being able to work with countries like Venezuela, work with countries like Iran, countries that have been oppressed by the U.S. and try to form something together if the U.S. places any kind of pressure or sanctions upon them. I think it's something that can be accomplished. But with that being said, Petro is by no means of the same breed as a Hugo Chavez, as a Fidel Castro. I don't think is going to reach that extreme where we're going to see that kind of response happen. But how successful he can be, that's yet to be seen. It's primarily based on the fact that there is not a majority in the parliament for leftist candidates. I mean, they did a fantastic job in these elections, in the parliamentary elections earlier in March, but they still don't hold a majority. So how much change can actually come right now, that's still yet to be determined.
Indeed. Of course, we're looking at what I'm assuming for this to be correct, where with Petro's victory, Arnold August, all but one of the Latin American major countries would be led by anti-establishment leftists, if you want to call. And the other one is Brazil, which we're looking at all projections pointing towards his win. And Lula da Silva is really the types of approaches that he has towards the whole region is quite phenomenal. I mean, when he talks about the unity that needs to exist, he talks about creating a currency in Latin America called SOR, which is to combat the dependency of the dollar, and basically to have the countries unite in order to cumulatively deal with inflation in the region. And this is in a move away from the U.S. So are all these countries going to be lined up on the same page when it comes to this, do you think?
That's a very important question. And in addition to what our colleague just mentioned, that one of the problems for the Petro Marquez ticket is that the majority is still in the hands of the right-wing forces in their parliament. In addition, one has to recognize the very ugly fact that the army is still in place, which is a very formidable force in Colombian politics. So, but on the positive side, even though Petro has been relatively critical of the Maduro government, which is, almost par for the course for these type of leftists, but at the same time, he did pledge to have good relationship with Venezuela and recognize the Maduro government, which is really earth-shaking, because all these years, since Chavez was first elected right up to recently, Colombia has been the main instrument of the United States to try to destabilize Venezuela and overthrow the Maduro government. Now, what Petro was saying is the opposite. He is going to establish good relationship with Venezuela.
Let me come to you then, if I may, Ahmed. Looking at a nail in the coffin, so to speak, of the way that the relationship between the U.S. and Latin American countries are, perhaps it's so evident than what happened just very recently. It was the Summit of the Americas. I mean, you're looking at headlines that says how weak the U.S. now is, what's behind American decline, the Summit of the Americas offering a measure of how far the U.S. has fallen, headlines like that. And of course, you had the ones who either didn't come or sent low-level delegations and basically boycotted what used to be a summit where they clamored up to join. Well, how did it get to that for the U.S. when it comes to these Latin American countries?
Well, you push somebody up against the wall, eventually they're gonna have nowhere to go except fighting back. Like I said earlier, we look at what happened back in the 80s or even before that. With a friend Montt in Guatemala, with Pinochet in Chile, the military junta in Argentina. I mean, this is what U.S. policy in Latin America was built on from the get-go. The whole Reagan-Contra affair that took place in Nicaragua. I mean, there are horror stories that take place as far back as the last millennia. And once the pink tide started to liberate these folks who had been subject to this type of policy from the U.S. for all these years, there was a blind eye turn, but now we have that second wave of the pink tide coming, and it's looking like it's going to be a clean sweep around Latin America. And at that point, that's how you end up seeing situations like the Summit of the Americas, where it's lost its respectability because you have all these countries right now who see it for the joke that it is, and see Venezuela and Cuba being excluded and saying, well, we want to create our own thing. This is what happens when you have this hyper-capitalistic, hyper-oppressive system, thinking that because you have a more powerful military and because you have this grand economy that folks are going to have to depend on, you can be as oppressive as you want to be. No, that's not going to happen. Eventually, folks are going to fight back. And you look at stories like little Cuba, a small, tiny island nation that had one of the worst embargoes for 50, 60 years, and it's still kicking. It's still surviving. And, I view that as the inspiration for Latin America. Hugo Chavez then comes in 1999, and it's this rebirth again. And now what we're seeing is, virtually every country in Latin America is now looking to the left, understanding that these policies of focusing on enriching the pockets of the West and the United States, hoping it'll trickle down for a select few in your country. The people are going to fight back, and they're going to say, we don't want to be excluded. And that's really who Petro focused on. He focused on the people on the periphery of Colombia, in these departments all the way in the periphery. That's where he won most of his votes in that first round, along with the major cities. Obviously, who always tend to point to the left. The one exception being the Department of Antioquia, which is the only one that kind of voted for the establishment. They supported Federico Gutierrez, and then the rest of the countries in Colombia, they kind of they had this fear of leftism because of this informational war that's always existed in Colombia that resulted in massive assassinations, including Bernardo Aramillo, the presidential candidate in 1990. 21 other lawmakers and hundreds of other politicians have been assassinated during that time, which is what made Colombia probably the most dangerous place for the left in the entire world. And so we're seeing that right with this historically.
All right. Well, it's very interesting how this has occurred for the U.S. Arnold August, and perhaps you can tell us. It just looks like the U.S. has fallen a step behind. I mean, there obviously must have been signs coming from Latin America. We could look at their policy towards Africa. Even there, they are behind the Chinese, even the Russians. Of course, when it comes to West Asia or the Middle East, as some call it, there also failed policies of the U.S. has almost have them out of that region, like countries, even their parliaments, like in Iraq, voting to have the U.S. out of their country, for example, U.S. forces. And a lot of this has to deal with the foreign policy of the U.S., I'm guessing. Of course, that's my guess. But how is it that the U.S. has fallen behind? And this comes all under how many people are saying it's a power that's on the wane, that's going down, so to speak.
Yeah, it is going down. I think we all saw Joe Biden falling off his bicycle a couple of days ago. I don't want to make fun of that, but it's indicative of something, I believe. I think one has to take into account that while the new Colombian government definitely has roadblocks ahead of itself, but time is on its side, because while in Los Angeles, the United States was excluding Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua from their summit there, a person called President Maduro at the very same time had a very successful Eurasian tour, including in Iran, which culminated in a new 20-year pact between Iran and Venezuela, including on defense and other issues. So you have this whole international development where left-wing governments in Latin America are also extending its principal ties with other countries as far away as Eurasia, and that is playing in the favor of the current Colombian government, who no doubt will have trouble in the next months and years, but they have this to look forward to, a strengthening of alliances, as you say, of countries all over the world, virtually, against U.S. hegemony. And there's no doubt about it, U.S. hegemony is definitely falling down, it's decreasing. Its importance on the world scale has been dealt very serious blows.
I'm going to give 30 seconds to you, Ahmed Eltouny. Our guest, Arnold August, talk about this historic visit by Maduro that came to Iran. You know, when you take a look at it, Venezuela having the most oil reserves, Iran coming in at third, aligned with Russia, and of course China. We could talk about how they are not only a good buyer of oil, but also they produce their own oil. But we are looking at what has now been deducted to be a bloc which controls almost 42% of oil reserves of the entire world. Isn't the U.S. concerned that due to their policies, these countries are aligning with each other, and in this case in point, gobbling up 42% or owning 42% of the world oil reserves? Obviously, that's going to spell trouble, especially taking a look at today's landscape.
Well, you know, since you're only giving me 30 seconds, I'll put it this way. I've always liked to say that the Clinton administration was the last administration of competent imperialists, right? Since then, we've had imperialists trying to, you know, just go, oppress, enrich the pockets of the wealthy and, you know, all that, but they haven't done a very good job. They haven't really thought things through. And this is kind of what we're seeing with this Biden administration, which is just kind of behaving the way it always has, thinking the U.S. is going to come out on top. But, you know, as you put it yourself, you see this block forming and the U.S. is kind of looking pretty stupid. Right?
Thank you for that. We appreciate it. Ahmed Eltouny from Union, New Jersey, co-chair the Green Party of the U.S. Arnold August, thank you so much, from Montreal, author and journalist. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Mikowa Tahwe. It's goodbye.